wasn't established until the 1860s. But this was one of Hamilton's ideas. Hamilton, in my book I quote a publication by the Federal Reserve entitled A History of Central Banking in America, where the Fed calls Hamilton the founding father of central banking in America. And they even say that he even talked like a modern day Fed chairman. And this was this whole episode of where Hamilton had started the first central bank. George Washington asked Hamilton and Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State, Hamilton was Secretary of Treasury, Jefferson was Secretary of State, to write their opinions on the constitutionality of a central bank, a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital. Now, this had been discussed at the Constitutional Convention and rejected. So it would seem if you just relied on the notes from James Madison and Robert Yates, who also published a book posthumously on what happened during the Constitutional Convention, that it would be very clear that this was not constitutional in the eyes of the people at the convention. But they had their debate, and Hamilton argued that the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution allowed for a bank because a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital would be necessary, Hamilton said, to carry out the delegated powers of the central government. Jefferson came back and said, no, it would just be convenient. He said, we have banks. We don't need a government bank. We have banks. It would just be convenient to have a government bank, but it's not necessary. The government exists now and we don't have a central bank. Anyway, Hamilton sort of won the argument, but not really. It wasn't the decision. George Washington decided to support the Bank of the United States. But it wasn't really because of the strength of Hamilton's arguments. It was because of a political deal that was cut. They had already agreed to move the nation's capital to Washington, D.C., to create Washington, D.C. And the political deal that was cut was the proponents of the bank said, we will extend, the Federalist Party politicians, we will extend the border of Washington, D.C. to be adjacent to Mount Vernon. If you, George Washington, go along with and support the creation of the Bank of the United States, which he did. And so it was sort of an ordinary political deal that led to this. So we got the first central bank, the Bank of the United States, and this is where Hamilton made his implied powers argument. He said, well, yes, the Constitution does not delegate to the central government the power to create a central bank, but that power is implied if you read between the lines. And Jefferson's attitude was, if you read between the lines, all you see is blank space. There's nothing there. But so that was really the origins, I think, of this whole idea of a living constitution. And of course, whenever you hear hear the phrase "living constitution," just substitute the word "no" for "living," and you'll know what they're talking about in general. But that began with Hamilton, at the very beginning with Hamilton. I'm not going to talk about this at all, but in one of the chapters of my book is entitled Hamilton's Disciple, How John Marshall Subverted the Constitution by Using Hamilton's Arguments about Implied Powers. So we got this bank, and it created, in 1791, created 72% inflation in the next 5 years. And Murray Rothbard writes about this in his book, A History of Money and Banking in the United States. And here's what he said. The Bank of the United States promptly fulfilled its inflationary potential by issuing millions of dollars in paper money and demand deposits, pyramiding on top of $2 million in specie. The bank invested heavily in loans to the United States government. In addition to $2 million invested in the assumption of pre-existing long-term debt assumed by the new federal government, the bank engaged in massive temporary lending to the government, which reached $6.2 million by 1796. The result of the outpouring of credit and paper money by the new Bank of the United States was an increase in prices of 72% just in the first 5 years. And the bank was discontinued. It had a 20-year charter, and the Congress did not recharter it. But then it did after the War of 1812. That's a good example of how war causes even the most staunch constitutionalists, forces them to abandon their principles on constitutional government. And so even James Madison had to go and be for the resurrection of the old Bank of the United States which they thought could help pay off some of the war debt from the War of 1812. And Murray Rothbard, actually his doctoral dissertation at Columbia was on the Panic of 1819, which is available online at the Mises Institute website, the whole book, The Panic of 1819. And the Bank of the United, he makes the case that the Bank of the United States caused the Panic of 1819. It was rechartered and went back into business in January of 1817 and promptly caused a depression 2 years later. And so Hamilton really is the founding father of central banking and all that goes with it, all the boom and bust cycle that is always been created by the Fed, the fact that a dollar is worth only 3 cents compared to what it was worth in 1913, the year the Fed was created. I think it's totally legitimate to call him the founding father of central banking. I have another chapter called The Founding Father of Crony Capitalism. And this is where Hamilton makes the case. He actually, when Thomas Jefferson made his first inaugural address, and he espoused his philosophy that government is best which governs least, Hamilton condemned it as, quote, the symptoms of a pygmy mind. He called him a mental pygmy for thinking that government ought to be limited. And so one of the other gambits of Hamilton was his famous report on manufacturers. And I quote William Graham Sumner in my book quite extensively. He wrote a biography of Hamilton in 1905, and Sumner was quite a famous, today we would call him a libertarian. He was a social scientist at Yale during this time. And he really criticizes the report on manufacturers, where Hamilton invented the phrase, the American system, which is really an Orwellian phrase, but it really was the British system of mercantilism brought to America. Protectionist tariffs, corporate welfare, we call it today corporate welfare, and a central bank to print money to pay for it all. That was the American system. And in my book, I give the quotation of Hamilton actually coined that phrase. And then the mantle of this was picked up by Henry Clay in the 1830s and 40s, and then by Lincoln after that, this whole the Hamiltonian system. And Hamilton, one of the short articles, after my appearance with Pat Buchanan, it was sort of a nasty shouting match at MSNBC. They had I sat there in their green room and watched the two guests before me, and they let them talk. It was all very calm. And I get in there, and there's 3 people shouting at me, and then I get up and leave. My time is up. And so you can't challenge the power structure at MSNBC, even if it has to do with Alexander Hamilton. But I went back and wrote a short article for the Mises Institute website on this whole idea of Hamilton being the architect of the U.S. economy by simply pointing out the nonsense of it by quoting Friedrich Hayek's famous idea of the pretense of knowledge, the notion that any one man could have enough knowledge to be the architect of a whole economy is silly. The economy is the efforts of many millions of people that create the economy. The U.S. economy, in fact, had doubled in size in the previous 80 years prior to Hamilton's becoming Treasury Secretary, and he couldn't have had anything to do with that. And I think he read Adam Smith, but he dismissed The Wealth of Nations altogether. He didn't believe that business could exist and thrive without the guiding hand of a central planner like himself and without government subsidies. So in his report on manufacturers, he has a big, long list of specific businesses and industries that need to be subsidized by the government. And he just didn't believe in the invisible hand theorem at all. And he made the same fatal mistakes that all the socialist central planners of the 20th century did, thinking that he could know better than the millions of people who participate in the actual economy. And so it really is a dumb idea to call any Hamilton or anybody else the architect. What he